Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine from the Napa Valley. The wine is from the Duckhorn Wine Company, and this is their Napa Valley Merlot. It's the 2019 vintage of that. I think when people think about Merlot in the context of California, one of the first things that comes to many people's minds, still 20 years on, is Miles, the character in Sideways, the film. And Miles is a wine snob, and he and his friend, whom he's going to be best man, have an argument prior to going out to dinner. And Miles's angry remark is, "And if anybody orders Merlot, I'm leaving." I think the effect that had on the reputation of the variety was incredibly unfair. I mean, especially given the fact that actually it's ironic, because Miles also goes on to attack the quality of Cabernet Francs, and yet the wine that he loves is an old vintage from the 1960s of Chateau Cheval Blanc, a wine that will be predominantly Cabernet Franc and Merlot. So I think that irony is lost on some people. Anyway, in the 20-year period since the film, Merlot has really not been the most popular of varieties, and yet one producer, Duckhorn, have really stood out as championing the variety. So in fact it was back in the 1970s, in 1976, Dan Duckhorn with his wife Margaret, they'd been to Bordeaux and they decided to start a winery in the Napa Valley, and Merlot was going to be one of the areas they concentrated on. They made the first vintage in 1978, and in that year they produced 800 cases of Cabernet Sauvignon, but also 800 cases of Merlot. And the winery built its reputation on this unfashionable grape variety. And in fact, when the Duckhorns came to sell in 2017, they had 400 hectares of their own vineyards, and were also buying from growers as well. Not entirely Merlot, I'll admit to that, but this certainly had been very successful with the variety. In fact, in 2015, they'd gone ahead and bought Three Palms Vineyard, which is probably the Napa Valley's most famous vineyard in terms of growing Merlot. The vineyards owned by the Duckhorn Wine Company include vineyards in Howell Mountain and Yountville in the Napa Valley, but they also have holdings in the Anderson Valley and the Russian River Valley. So it was in 2017 that a private equity firm, TSG Consumer Partners, bought the winery. 2019 was a vintage that actually started with quite a wet winter. There was a mild spring, but the entire season started a bit late. Having said that, once the summer got into its swing, it was a beautiful summer for growing and ripening grapes evenly. There were no heat spikes. It was beautifully warm throughout the season, and picking went ahead without any particular disease pressures. The resultant fruit gave elegant tannins, beautiful aromatics, and some really lovely fruit flavours. Particular wine, the Napa Valley Merlot, comes from vineyards in Carneros, Calistoga, Oak Knoll, Yountville, the Napa Valley and Howell Mountain. So there really is a blend of widely different areas, many of them with quite different climates. I mean, from the cool of Carneros up to the warmth of Calistoga, the mountain influence of Howell Mountain, and the valley floor in Yountville. The wine is labelled as a Merlot, but the blend is actually only 90% of Merlot. American wine law allows a fair proportion of other varieties, and blended with this, there's 8% of Cabernet Sauvignon and a percentage each of Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. The wine aged in French oak barrels, I would assume barriques, 225 litre barriques, but that's not actually stated. And 40% of those barrels were new, the remaining 60% obviously being seasoned, having been used before, and the wine stayed in barrel for 15 months. So let's have a look at it, shall we? See what we make of it. There is a lovely deep dark colour here, and quite considering that the wine is about 5 years old, coming up for 5 years old, there's quite a sort of a purple rim there, so still a little bit of youthfulness. The wine's got 14.5% alcohol, so it should be fairly weighty, and I mean Merlot tends to get relatively high alcohol levels. This is fairly readily throwing tears onto the inside of the glass, and actually it's very, very slightly staining the glass. It's quite a dark colour there. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? There's a lovely, pure, rich, ripe, fresh plumminess runs through this, and then there's almost a sort of a slightly smoky note of oak just following up through it, and with that there's perhaps touches of cedar, touches of cocoa, a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of sweet spice, nutmeg, cinnamon. There's almost a sort of a side of it that's slightly sort of Bordeaux-like, but yet the lovely opulent fruit stands out a little bit more, and it's not just opulent, it's beautifully fresh as well. Opulent might suggest overripe, but no, this seems sort of fully ripe and fresh. So let's taste. From the outset, that's structured. There's ripe fruit, there's warming alcohol. The structure is fine, it's grainy, but actually the tannins very quickly become quite supple. There's a richness and almost licoricey core that comes in there. But it's lovely and juicy. The acidity is keeping the wine fresh, despite it's quite rich, quite warming alcohol there. The alcohol towards the back of the palate is starting to sort of show up a little bit of the cedary, cinnamon, sweet spice notes there, thanks to the warmth. And then that sort of moves on to a sort of a richness, darker fruits, damson, bullace, those sort of notes towards the end of the flavours and heading to the finish. Initially there was more of that sort of fresh, plummy red fruit, and then the plumminess re-establishes itself at the end, along with those sort of spicy, slightly smoky notes. It's almost a sort of a slightly peppery note there. There's no unripe leafiness really at all. The lovely freshness continues. This is a wine with some really lovely balance. It doesn't have the greatest complexity. It's quite a straightforward, pure fruit shining through. That fruit in itself has layers of flavour and texture that sort of are opening out quite nicely. It's not a particularly complex wine, but for a fruit-driven wine of this sort, it is displaying multiple layers in a way that's very attractive. And this is still quite a young wine, so that will probably, those layers will probably develop as it ages. And I would think that that's a wine that would very happily age for at least 5 or 6 years, possibly longer. There's no imperative to age it before drinking, and it's lovely and accessible now. But it is a wine with sort of medium to full body, rich alcohol, and there's a real presence there, so that would work well with strong foods. So yes, very interesting wine. Thank you very much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. Do consider signing up and following us on YouTube. It would be fantastic to have your support there. If you have friends who you think might like to see the video, please feel free to share it with them. And if you want more details of this wine, I'll put some notes in the box below so that you can find out where you can buy it, what its pricing is, and any more details we have on that. You can also look back at its price history and things like that. So, very much hope that you'll manage to find some time to come and join us for another tasting in the near future. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.